NeoQor.
Hey guys, welcome back to another Tip Tuesday video. It is the first video of 2019. Woo woo! As usual, my name is NeoQor. We're here in the studio, and today we're going to be talking about a nifty little thing called compression. So last week, if you may remember, we talked about another tool for reducing peaks known as soft clipping or soft saturation. So in this week's video, we're going to be talking about yet another tool that we can use for reducing peaks, and that is compression. So this tool is by far one of the most important things to use on just about every part of your mix. Pretty much every compressor across each DAW utilizes the same kind of parameters, right? So this is a fruity compressor, right? So we have our threshold, here's our ratio, there's our gain, which is our makeup gain. This one doesn't have a pre-gain, this one just has a post-gain. Our attack, release, and then the type of compression, which is the knee of compression. I'll get into that in just a bit. But this is your basic compressor, right? This is what I use. I use Fruity Compressor. Just about every DAW has a stock compressor. There are a lot of different third-party VST compressors you can get too. I just pretty much use the stock because it works for me, and that's really all I need. So how do you use this thing, right? So a lot of first-time producers aren't really sure what this is for and, you know, how to use it. It you know, was something that I was a little bit unfamiliar with when I first got into producing. But as you will come to learn, it's one of the most important things you can use. So what compression does is it basically reduces the peak of your sound. So once your sound crosses this line, this threshold, which is a certain level, however many decibels it goes over that threshold, it'll compress it by a certain ratio. So if it goes, let's say with this ratio, if it goes over negative 12.5 dB, every 7.5 dB that it goes over negative 12.5, it'll compress down to 1 dB. So it really reduces that peak. I typically just use presets when I'm using a compressor. I don't need to get too fancy. What I'll do with this compressor is I'll typically add it to my drums, and I will just go into the preset menu here, and there's an internal preset that's called drums, and I set it to drums. Sometimes I'll turn the makeup gain up just a little bit more if I want my sound to be a little bit louder, a little bit girthier. But I typically won't go any higher than like 13 dB in makeup gain, because after that point it kind of starts to squash the sound a little bit. So let me go ahead and show you this in action. So for those of you who are still kind of lost on what a compressor does, I can show you another example of a compressor, and I will show you that in the form of the Fruity Limiter. Now, limiting is another type of compression, but I'm not going to get into that right now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to flip over to the compressor part of the limiter right here, and this is the threshold, and we have our ratio here that controls how much it's compressed, right? And then we have the knee, which kind of does the same thing. It basically, you can make it a harder knee or a softer knee. Basically it's just another setting for how much it compresses. I don't really know all the technical details of how the knee works, but I just know that you can, if you turn it up higher, it compresses it more. So yeah, so there's that. It's 3 knobs here, and then your attack, your release. So what I have here in the sequencer is a snare, and I'm going to use it on the snare, so because that's the effects chain we're looking at, right? So I disabled the other Fruity compressor, and right now we're just going to use the limiter compressor for illustrative purposes. Because it's graphic, it's much more graphic. You can actually see the waveforms, and you can see how it works a little bit better than the Fruity compressor, which is just a bunch of knobs. So I'm going to play the snare, and so you can see the snare there. There's the waveform, and this blue line, you can probably see that a little bit better when I turn the input signal off. You can see this blue line, that's the waveform represented in the compressor, right? The signal represented in the compressor, the input. What we want to do, if you want to compress the peaks, you bring this line down, this threshold, to just below the peak, and it'll start, you turn the ratio down and it'll start compressing the peak, right? So I'll play it, unpause it, and you see this white line here, that's that little dip, that's showing the gain reduction, that's showing how much it's being compressed every time that snare spikes up over that threshold, right? Go ahead and unpause it and keep playing it. You bring it down further, you can cause it to compress more by doing one of two things. You can lower the threshold, or you can raise the ratio. But be careful of raising the ratio too much, because it'll start to just flatten it out and it'll squash it. And now you see here, with it all the way down like that, and now it's really, really squashing that snare. So I say this a lot, and it still holds true with this, season to taste. When it comes to compression, what I typically do is I'll typically turn the attack down to 0, and I'll turn the release up to where I can see the line of the waveform, and it's pretty smooth, but it's not too long. So let me explain what attack and release are, right? So the attack is the amount of time it takes for the compressor to fully kick in once that signal goes over the threshold. And then the release is the amount of time it takes for the compressor to fully release and let off after it starts compressing. So if you turn your attack all the way up, then there's gonna be a little bit of a delay in, you know, the time or the point in time where the compressor fully kicks in. There's just gonna be a longer delay there. So you may get a little bit more of the initial snap of the sound. And then if you turn the release all the way up, here, I'll just show you. So I turn the release all the way up, and now you can see this curve, this input, it's a lot longer. So it's illustrating a much longer time, a much longer period of gain reduction when I turn that release up. I don't really make it that long, because otherwise you'll start to hear the gain reduction in your mix, and you don't want it to be really long and loose, you know. I personally like my compression to sound tight. I want it only to work on the sound itself, on the duration of the sound. I don't want it to still be happening after the sound is already triggered. So now you can hear it sounds a lot tighter. That's what I'll typically do. I usually don't mess with the release too much. I usually leave it about where it's at. I turn the attack up, then you'll see there's a little bit of a peak, a little bit of a spike in the beginning, because see, what's happening is the snare is hitting, and then there's a little, like, few milliseconds delay between the time that the snare is hitting and the time that the compressor is kicking in. So I turn that input off, and you can see the output there, and so see that little spike, that's the delay in time. So if you want to give your sound a little extra snap in the beginning, you can do that by turning the attack up on the compressor. But you know, I typically don't do that, because I use the compressor for reducing peaks. I don't want a big fucking spike on the top of the, at the beginning of this sound, so I usually just turn it all the way down, because I'm just using compression to reduce the overall peak of the sound, and I do that just by compressing the entirety of it. So that's pretty much compression in a nutshell. You can see here the snare is pretty squashed, so I don't want it to be that way. I don't want it to be squashed like that, so I'm going to bring the threshold up a little bit and probably turn the ratio down just a bit so it's not compressing so hard. My typical rule of thumb, if I'm compressing using the limiter, then I go by this blue line here, and I don't want to go all the way down. I don't want to bring the threshold all the way down to the base of the sound. If I want to compress the peaks, then I'll basically kind of go like midway and just bring the threshold just below that spike of the signal, because that's really the only part I want to compress. And then I'll bring the ratio up just a little bit so it compresses a little bit more to my satisfaction. So you've still got a little bit of an initial peak there. Yeah. And the look ahead, not really sure what that does, to be completely honest. I don't really mess with that. I'm going to turn that down. There we go. I think that did away with the, yeah, that did away with the spike there. But you know, we can do for a little bit of a peak in the beginning. Just a tiny bit. So now if I take all this away, so I'd say that's pretty good right there. Yeah, that's a pretty good place for our snare to be. It's, you know, it's got a little bit of a range. It's not spiking up too high. It's got a nice snap in the beginning. It sounds good, and it's pretty girthy, you know, like it's not going to cause a lot of unnecessary peaking on the master channel when I introduce this into the whole entirety of the mix. That's compression on Fruity Limiter. Now, like I said, I use that as just kind of an illustrative example, so you can kind of see how the compressor works. The Fruity compressor works pretty much the same way. I mean, it's a compressor, but this is just knobs. But this is what I normally use, and what I'll typically do with this, I'll just show you what I actually do when I'm compressing drums. I'll bring up this compressor, and I'll go to presets, and I'll hit drums, and then I'm going to play the snare. So now it's a lot louder. And what drums does is it compresses it quite a bit, but then it boosts the gain quite a bit. And what I'll typically do is I'll turn the attack down, leave the release the same, and I'll bring the gain up to about let's bring it up to about 11 and a half. So that's a lot louder. But what I will do on top of that, I'll turn the compressor on the limiter off, and I'll go over to the actual limiter on the Fruity Limiter, and I'll limit any unnecessary peaks. So just so you know, limiting is also a type of compression, but limiting is like brick wall compression, basically. So with normal compression, signal passes over the threshold, and it compresses it a little bit. It brings the level, it reduces the level, but there's still signal crossing over that threshold. With limiting, that threshold is basically a brick wall, and nothing passes over that threshold. And so we call that threshold on a limiter the ceiling, and nothing passes over that ceiling. You can really squash sounds if you're not careful, but limiting is great for mastering, and I also use it for mixing too. I use it just as some kind of final peak reduction on a lot of my drums, but I use it very slightly. I don't use it a lot. So we'll go ahead and use it on the snare. So it looks like we're getting a little bit of a peak on this snare. So what I'll do is I'll just bring the ceiling down just a tiny bit. We're seeing a couple of bumps in gain reduction there. I want to smooth that out. So I'll turn the release up, because I don't want it to be two instances. I don't want it to be two dips. I want it to dip once, you know, in a uniform way, if that makes sense. I want that gain reduction to be one instance, one thing happening. Because if you have the gain reducing, dipping multiple times in one instance of a sound playing, then you can sometimes hear that, and it can sound kind of weird, like the sound is going in and out. Of course, this is very slight, so it probably wouldn't be noticeable anyways, but it's my personal taste. So it crosses that ceiling just a little bit, and it dips just a little bit, and now you can see here the difference. So that little purple bit is what's being reduced. It's what's being taken down. It's still got, you know, it's not a total like block. It's not squared off. I don't want it to be squared off, but it's pretty fat. It's pretty loud. It's got a good amount of girth to it, and again, it's not going to cause any real unnecessary peaks on the master channel. You want to try to reduce peaks like this on all of your sounds as much as you can without squashing it too much, so that when everything comes together on the master channel, you're not going to have a bunch of different sounds playing at different times, causing your master level to go up and down and fluctuate like a friggin' graph on, you know, the stock market. You don't want that to happen. You want your master channel to be pretty level on on the loudest, on the loudest parts of your song when everything's going at once. You want your master channel to be fairly consistent. You don't want it to fluctuate too much. I'm not saying dynamic range is bad. I'm just saying, in dance music, you don't want it spiking, because that'll make it harder to get it to sound good when you're trying to master it and it's peaking, and then suddenly it's causing your limiter to go crazy because you've got these random peaks at different points in your song. You don't want that to happen. So that's why we compress. And I'm just going to show you what I do on compression when I introduce a new sound. And this is pretty much what I do for all my drums again. So boom, make it a 4x4. We're just going to throw this in here. So now we've got So we've got a clap in there. We can't really hear it that well though. And that's part of where compression comes in. So I bring the clap into the mixer, and the first thing I do when I'm mixing down drums, the first thing I introduce every time is a compressor. Every time. And then I bring the drums preset, boom. Turn up the gain just a little bit. Boom. The clap's gonna be way louder now, so I'm gonna have to bring that level down. So I'll bring it down just a little bit. Right, so boom, there we go. And then I'll bring up a limiter on the clap, and we'll just take a look at how it's looking as a waveform and see if it's spiking a little too much, and if we can't bring it down just a bit. And it's pretty rounded off already, but we can go ahead and reduce it just a little bit more, so it's not spiking too much. Compression's pretty simple. The main challenge is just wrapping your head around the concept of like what it does and how it works. A lot of people overlook it when they first start out producing because they see it and they're just like, I don't know what any of this is. I don't know what it does. When you're first starting, you can't really hear the difference. So it's something you really just got to understand how it works and why it's important. I hope this video kind of helped illuminate that a little bit and help you understand the importance of compression and how you can use it in your mix downs. This concept carries across just about every DAW. I mean, like I said, every DAW has a compressor in some way, shape, or form, and most compressors, I mean, they all pretty much have the same parameters and features and stuff. Just knowing the basic functions and how it works, I mean, that it'll make a world of difference in your mix. So yeah, that's pretty much it. If you have any questions, email me at neoqor@gmail.com, or just reach out to me, Facebook, NeoQor, or on Instagram, that's official NeoQor. And yeah, I will see you next week for another Tip Tuesday. Until then, have a good day and have a wonderful 2019. Bye-bye.